Greetings, math fans. All right, so this is day 2 of chapter 8. So chapter 8 and day 2. Okay, and basically we're going to solve equations like we did on day 1. We solved the quadratics using factoring. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to use this something called the square root property. Okay, so square root property. And the key to the square root property, let's actually just do a really the most basic problem. If I have x squared equals 64, okay, what you're going to do is basically we're going to take the square root of both sides. We're trying to solve for x. So if I take the square root of both sides, my answer is x equals, and I am going to make this in big bold red because you need this for every problem where you take the square root, a plus or minus. Okay, plus or minus the square root of 64 is 8. This is my answer to this problem. That's why it's a pretty basic problem. So x equals plus or minus 8. Please do not forget the plus or minus. Okay, so the reason it is a plus or minus is, let's go back to the original problem. So it's x squared equals 64. So basically I'm asking you, hey, what can I square to give me 64? Well, do you guys agree, of course, if I square 8, I get 64, because 8 times 8 is 64. Same thing if I square negative 8, because really negative 8 is the same thing as negative 8, or negative 8 squared is the same thing as negative 8 times negative 8, which is positive 64. That's why it can either be a positive 8 squared or a negative 8 squared to give me the correct answer. Okay? So, again, I cannot stress that enough. When you take the square root, at that very step, when you take the square root, you need to have plus or minus. It's so important. Okay, if you forget it, you will lose 1 point per problem. Okay, because you won't have the right answer. Okay, so let's just do another example here, right? If I said, x squared equals, let's do 4, right? Take the square root of both sides. So x equals plus or minus 2, square root of 4. Okay, you can use your calculator, it's fine. Okay, plus or minus, huge. Okay, so let's do one a little bit different. Let's do x squared equals negative 64. Okay, so we'll take the square root of both sides, just like normal. Now, some of you guys might say, oh, gee, this is, if I take the square root of negative 64, it's an error, right? On your calculator, you can't do it. Well, it's true, but guys, this is the last chapter. When I take the square root of negative 64, remember there's an I there. So I'm going to just show you quickly. So first of all, the square root of x squared is x. And the square root of negative 64 is, let me show you the long way, and then I'm just going to tell you guys how to do it quickly, because you should be able to do it quickly. So it's negative 1 times 64. Square root of negative 1 is I, and the square root of 64, so let me just write that, 64, and then the square root of 64 is 8. So really it's 8i. So what I would like you to do is, as soon as you see a square root of some negative whatever it is, you need to start writing out as I square root of whatever it is. Okay, so that number under the square root turns into I. Okay, so when I do this, let's go back to our original problem here. When I take the square root of both sides, I get x equals, and then don't forget, it's plus or minus. And the square root of negative 1 is I, so we're going to put an I there. Well, what's the square root of 64? It's 8. And you're done with the problem. Okay? So it's very similar to what we did before, guys. If I just said, hey, what's the square root of 64? You tell me it's 8i. Well, now it's just plus or minus 8i because I'm taking the square root of both sides. Okay? So, again, let me try another quick problem here. If I said x squared equals negative 25. Okay, take the square root of both sides. So you get x equals plus or minus, square root of 25 is 5, and then that negative 1, so it's plus or minus 5i. Okay, x squared equals negative 49. Square root of both sides, x equals plus or minus, square root of 49 is 7, so 7i. Okay, if you have a negative under the square root, you're going to have an I there, guys. It's just pretty much what it is. Okay? All right, so that's pretty basic, right? So let's just we're going to progress here in level of difficulty, but again, not too brutal. If I said x squared equals 20, okay, well, you take the square root of both sides. So I get x equals plus or minus, and then, just like we did last chapter, simplify that square root of 20. 2 times 2 times 5. So the pair of 2's come out. So x equals plus or minus, you bring the 2 out, 2, and then root 5 left over, and you're done with the problem. What? It's pretty easy. So with this one, x squared is equal to, let's do 45. Okay, so take the square root of both sides. So x equals plus or minus, don't forget that, and 45 is, if I divide by 2, I can't, so divide by 3. So 3, divide by 3 again, 3, and then 5. So if you keep, again, remember I told you this is from back in the day, when you're taking square roots, you're going to do 2, 3, 5, and 7. Okay, when you start dividing out. Okay, so anyway, this comes out, so x equals plus or minus 3 root 5, and that's your answer. Okay, let's do one with a negative. So x squared equals negative 20. Again, no big deal. Take the square root of both sides. So x equals plus or minus, and what's the square root of negative 20? It's, just pull an I out right away. Just do that, because the negative square root of negative 1 is I. Pull it out, and then this is going to be 2 times 2 times 5. So you pull out a pair of 2s. So x equals plus or minus 2I root 5. Okay? Not bad. All right, so again, let's progress into a little more challenging one. I have 2x squared minus 3 equals 15. So guys, our goal is to isolate that x squared, or the squared term. Okay, so in order to do that, it's like a regular algebra problem. I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So 2x squared equals 18. I'm going to divide by 2. You guys should be good at that. So I get x squared equals 9. Take the square root of both sides. X equals plus or minus 3. That was pretty easy. Okay, so let's do one with an I in it now. So 2x squared plus 3 equals negative 15. Subtract 3 from both sides. So 2x squared equals negative 18. And then divide by 2. So x squared equals negative 9. And I take the square root of both sides. So you get x equals plus or minus. Don't forget plus or minus. And the square root of negative 9 is 3i. Okay? So you can see, guys, it's pretty much the same. Look at this. If I look at this problem, and this problem are pretty much the same, except this one's going to give you, over here, this one's going to give you positive 9. This one's going to give you negative 9. And so you just deal with it, right? So this one comes out to be, square root of 9 is 3, so plus or minus 3. And this one's going to be negative 9. So it's still I, and then the square root of 9 is 3. So that's why it's 3i. Okay, and don't forget the plus or minus. Okay, cool. All right, let's keep going here. Here's a good one. So let's do x minus 3 squared equals 16. Okay, so what we're going to do is you're going to take the square root of both sides. First of all, that x minus 3 quantity squared is isolated. It's all by itself. There's not a number on the outside of it. It's just you're solving for whatever's being squared, which happens to be x minus 3 squared. Okay? All right, so let me get rid of this little red dealy here. So I take the square root of both sides. So I get x minus 3 equals, now again, square root of 16 plus or minus 4. So this is kind of the only case really where you're going to do a little bit more work here. You're going to tell me x minus 3 equals 4 and x minus 3 equals negative 4. So you're not going to have an answer of like plus or minus. All the other ones were like plus or minus 2 and plus or minus 3 and plus or minus 7, right? This is, you got plus or minus here, but we're not done with the problem yet. So it's x minus 3 equals plus 4 and x minus 3 equals negative 4. And then you're going to solve for x for each one of these. So x equals 7. And I'm going to add 3 here. X equals negative 1. And guys, these are your answers. Okay, it's not plus or minus. It's 7 and negative 1. Those are 2 of your answers, or the 2 answers that you have. Okay? So it's really not that bad. Again, this is the only time you're going to have a problem like this is when it's when these are all whole numbers. So these are whole numbers. Okay? If they weren't whole numbers, it was like the square root of 16 or whatever, you wouldn't split it up. The square root of 16. So it's like the square root of 20, you wouldn't split it up because the square root of 20 is not a perfect square and you can't do anything with it. Square root of 16, you would be able to split it up because it would be, well, we just did it here. That's 4 and 4. Okay? All right, so let's do another one here. 2 parentheses x plus 2 squared equals 18. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to solve for that x plus 2 quantity squared. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2. So I get x plus 2 squared equals 9. And then I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So x plus 2 equals plus or minus 3. We have two answers. X plus 2 equals 3, and x plus 2 equals negative 3. Okay? And then you solve each one of these. So subtract 2, x equals 1. Subtract 2, x equals negative 5. So there are your two answers. Okay? It's really not that bad. It's again progressively getting more difficult, but it's not difficult. You gotta solve for the x squared term. Make sure you have plus or minus, and then you continue solving after that. All right. So here's another one for you. X minus 4 squared equals 32. Okay, it's already solved. Don't have to do anything. Just take the square root of both sides. Okay, so we have x minus 4 equals plus or minus, and the square root of 32, well, let's figure it out. That's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. It's actually 5 of those. So I can pull 2 2's out. So it's x minus 4 equals plus or minus. If I pull 2 2's out, I get 2 times 2 is 4, and I have a 2 left over. So guys, this is not a whole number. So I'm going to write this in here. Not a whole number. So if this is not a whole number, you can't put it together. So literally what you're going to do is you're just going to add 4 to both sides. And your answer is going to be x is equal to 4 plus or minus 4 root 2. And that's your answer. Okay? So because you can't put them together. But you try to, but you can't. Okay? If this was, again, if let's say this term came out to be, I don't know, 3, then you would say x minus 4 equals 3, x minus 4 equals negative 3, and you'd solve. Okay, but it's equal to 4 root 2, so you can't add them together anyway. That's why it's 4 plus or minus 4 root 2. Okay. Okay, I've got about, 3 more problems to do with you guys. Just problems that get a little progressively more difficult here. So 2 parentheses 3x plus 2 squared minus 3 equals 9. So I'm going to solve for that. I'm solving for this, guys. So I'm solving for this. So what you're going to do is, just like with an algebra problem, you're going to add 3 first to both sides. So 2 parentheses 3x plus 2 squared equals 12. And then I'm going to divide by 2. So 3x plus 2 is equal to 6. Okay? Oops, that's squared. Okay, so this is like back in the day. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So I get 3x plus 2 equals plus or minus root 6. And I know they're not whole numbers because root 6 is not a perfect square. So I'm literally going to subtract 2 from both sides. And I get 3x is equal to, let me just have a little more room here. So 3x is equal to negative 2 plus or minus root 6. Okay? Your last step is divide both sides by 3. Nothing fancy. So x equals negative 2 plus or minus root 6 over 3. And that's your final answer. Okay, it looks like it's like not really simplified all that much, but it is. Okay, you can't, if these are whole numbers, you can combine them together, but they're not, so you can't combine them together. Okay? Okay, let's do one with an imaginary number here now. Let's do -3 parentheses x plus 4 squared equals 27. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to isolate this guy right here. So I'm going to divide both sides by -3. So I get x plus 4 equals -9. Okay? So, and that's squared, of course. So I just take the square root of both sides, and so I get x plus 4 equals plus or minus, and you guys should say, oh, the square root of 9 is I, and the square root of 9 is 3, so 3 or 3I. So this is not a whole number, so you can't just put it together. So if it was a whole number, then I would say x plus 4 equals positive of that number, and x plus 4 equals negative of that number. Okay, but I'm not going to do that because it's an I there. So if I subtract 4 from both sides, I get x equals -4 plus or minus 3I. And that's it. You're done with the problem. Okay? All right, so last problem is kind of a humdinger. It's a doozy, or whatever word you want to use. Okay, so here it is. It's got everything in it. So 2 parentheses 4x plus 3 squared plus 5 equals -19. Woo! That's a crazy one. No big deal. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to solve for this guy right here. Okay, so I'm going to subtract 5 first. So I get 2 parentheses 4x plus 3 squared is equal to -24. Okay, then I'm going to get rid of that 2 by dividing both sides by 2. So I get 4x plus 3 squared equals -12. Okay? And then you're going to take the square root of both sides because it's already isolated. And so you're going to get 4x plus 3 equals square root of 12. First of all, as an I comes out. And 12 is 2 times 2 times 3. So this comes out. So I have 4x plus 3. And by the way, I forgot my plus and minus. Boo! Do not forget plus or minus. Okay, so you pull a 2 out. So it's plus or minus 2I root 3. And guys, that's all I can do. I can't do anything more to that, 2I root 3, so it's just, you leave it like that. So now, again, I'm back at this point here. So I'm going to actually, well, I'm going to just do my work here. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So you get 4x is equal to -3 plus or minus 2I root 3. Okay? And then I'm going to divide both sides by 4. And I get x equals -3 plus or minus 2I root 3 over 4. And that's all you can do. There's nothing else you can do here, guys. So you're done with the problem. Okay? So again, all these problems are all like kind of nasty looking, like -3 plus or minus something. The only time it's never plus or minus something, if literally I get x equals, let's say 5 plus or minus, 7, something like that. Don't leave it like that. If you leave 5 plus or minus 7, I'm going to be like, come on, guys. You can simplify this. 5 plus 7 and 5 minus 7. So that would be 12 and -2, and you'd have 2 answers. Okay, but if it's anything like 5 plus or minus 7i, or something with a radical, 5 plus or minus 2 root 3, okay, you can't put those together, so you leave them like that. Otherwise, you simplify it to like a 12 and a -2, right? To single numbers, whole numbers. Okay? So that's it, math fans. That is the square root property. So hopefully you guys are good to go with this, but it really isn't that difficult. Just don't forget what? Plus or minus. Huge. Okay? Anyway, you have an outstanding day, math fans. Adios. Goodbye.